Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not so distant past. The jumping off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. Hello, fellow armchair historians. In this episode, I talked to Jeffrey H. Jackson, historian and author of the book Paper Bullets, which captures the riveting and courageous story of Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe, two gender norm-defying artists better known as Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. Now, Suzanne and Lucy undertook a dangerous years-long anti-propaganda campaign which used art to demoralize the Nazis. Paper Bullets was named a 2020 Stonewall Honor Book and Nonfiction and Best Book of 2020 by Booklist, as well as longlisted for the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. Jeffrey H. Jackson, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure.
I was very excited that you said yes. I love World War II history. Well, let's just get right into it, and I'm going to ask the question, what is your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
Well, the kind of history that I really like to read and write, and in my teaching, I'm a college professor, the kind of stuff that I really like to think about are small stories that really open up bigger windows onto the past. So sometimes this is called microhistory, or sometimes it's called history of everyday life. But I like to get at these kind of small episodes and then kind of dig behind the scenes to figure out, how does that episode open up a whole new world for us? And so the story behind my most recent book called Paper Bullets is the story of two women and their anti-Nazi resistance. And it seems like a very small story, and in some ways it is. It's just these two people and their work. But once you really start to dig into it and you start to really sort of see the story behind it, it really opens up a whole world. And to me, that's just fascinating when that happens.
I absolutely loved this book. I actually listened to it this week while I was multitasking. So I listened to it from Audible, and it was one of the things I wanted to comment on is what you just said, and the mundane everyday life and how you bring that out in this story. And I think especially when it comes to World War II in Europe, I find that extremely interesting because it's not like the movies. We see the big battles and that type of thing. It's really, I think the story is, and you nail it in this book, is the everyday life and what it's really like to live in an occupied country. My mother was born in Belgium, and they were refugees of war in France. And I was always fascinated by the stories she would tell, and she was living in a militaristic town, French town. But I think that, it's the mundane life and it's the things that you don't think about. And I think that the real gems are in that, and you do a really good job of bringing that out in this book. So why don't you tell us about the book?
So, one of the ways that I talk about this book, and actually kind of fits with what you just said, is it's the World War II story you've never heard before. Because, as you say, we often do hear the big stories, the battles, the military campaigns, and we don't often think as much about the day-to-day life. And in particular, in the place where this book happens. I mean, this is on the island of Jersey. It's one of the Channel Islands. It's in the English Channel. It's the only bit of British soil that the Nazis occupied and conquered during the war. So the Channel Islands are just off the French coast in the English Channel between Britain and France. And it was a really strategic area. This was it was part of what Hitler called his Atlantic Wall. I mean, the Atlantic Wall was a series of fortifications along the Atlantic coast to prevent Allied assault on the conquered lands that Hitler had taken. And so these islands were really important, and yet, interestingly, we don't hear about them. But it's really the story of these two women. They were French artists. They were stepsisters. They were also lovers. Their whole lives were intertwined and had been for many decades, even by the time they arrive on the island of Jersey. And when they get there, they think that they're going to live a quiet life, sort of in retirement. They're going to be able to do their art and just sort of live, and enjoy themselves. And only just a few years after they arrive on Jersey, the war starts and the Nazis arrive. And so they really have a choice to make. They have to decide, are they going to sort of sit out the war quietly? Are they going to flee like a lot of people did? And many people left the islands and went to Britain. Or are they going to fight? Are they going to resist? And so they debate amongst themselves, and eventually they decide that they will resist in whatever way that they can. And that turns out to be and I think this is another aspect of the story that's really fascinating to a lot of people, is that it's a type of resistance that most people have never heard of. When you hear stories about resistance, you think of, violent acts or trying to do something that's really big and dramatic. But their resistance was small. It was quiet. And they were essentially leaving notes for the Nazis to find, trying to demoralize the Nazis. There are many aspects of this story that are so surprising, and every time I've talked to folks about it, they really express the sense of, I didn't know any of this. This is really new information to me.
I talked to a couple people and said that I was going to be interviewing you and what the book was about, and I can't tell you how many people said, I didn't know that the Channel Islands were occupied. I was surprised that how completely the British made a decision that was it. They could not protect the islands, and so they just let them go to the Nazis.
Right. They left the island. They basically said we were not able to defend this territory, and they sort of thought that the Germans wouldn't really care. They sort of assumed that the Germans wouldn't find it to be useful or interesting, and in fact, it turned out to be very important for the Germans. So the fact that we don't really hear the story of the Channel Islands, at least in the United States, we don't hear that story. I think in Britain, they're a little bit more familiar with that story than we are, certainly. But usually when we talk about the European theater of the war, we tend to leave that out. And it's remarkable. Again, this is where the small story opens up into a bigger story behind it. To me, that was part of what was so fascinating in doing this book.
Did you see the Google graphic this week of Claude?
I did see that. And I made sure to put it out on my social media.
I had just started doing research, for this interview. And I was like, I know that image. Like, that's an image of something I'm familiar with. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, it was Claude. And I think the other thing about the book really is about World War II and the resistance to paper bullets. Mm-hmm. But they had a whole life before that was extremely fascinating as well. Maybe you could talk a little bit about them in France and what their life was like then.
Yeah, absolutely. This story is so fascinating from start to finish, in part because the lives of these two women were really sort of remarkable lives. And the way I talk about them is that they were really resistors their whole lives. So that by the time they get to Jersey and push back against the Nazis, they've been doing resistance work of some form or other for decades. So some listeners might be more familiar with them. So their birth names were Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe, but some listeners might be more familiar with them with their artistic names. So they took these new artistic names when they got to Paris, or even before they got to Paris, and their names were Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. And so Claude Cahun was the Google Doodle the other day. That's what you were referring to. As artists, they lived in Paris in the 1920s, this really exciting, vibrant time. Of course, also just after World War I, so also, there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of political unrest. But there were also a lot of people like them who had moved to the city to have new experiences. And so they plug into the artistic scene. Claude Cahun was a writer. Marcel Moore was an illustrator. And together they collaborated and made these amazing photographs. And that's really what they're famous for today. And a lot of their work actually hangs in some of the world's best museums. And you can sometimes see their work. And if you see it, it would be their photography. That's really kind of what they've become famous for. A lot of the photographs are things that, today we might find them sort of strange or bizarre. I mean, they were sort of associated with the surrealists in Paris in the 20s. So doing this work that was really challenging, really trying to sort of force people to ask questions about what is beauty? What is art? Kind of playing with people's expectations. And they were involved in all of that, very, very much a part of that community. So what's interesting about them, though, too, is that they were not really famous in their day. They were part of this artistic community, but they didn't really promote themselves. They both came from money. They didn't really need to sell artwork or, to sort of, they didn't have to be famous in order to have resources. So I think they were just sort of exploring their ideas, exploring their identities, because as a lesbian couple, they were also sort of challenging some sexual and gender norms of their day. After they left Paris and left the art world behind, they kind of fell off the map for a long time. And so they were kind of not really known as artists, and they were sort of rediscovered again in the 1980s. And really ever since then, and especially in the last, I'll say 10 or 15 years, have really gotten a lot of attention. And that's why Google, for example, made them the Google Doodle, made Claude Cahun the Google Doodle the other day, because they're sort of becoming famous again after many years.
Yeah, I feel like they were on the forefront of what we would think today is, exploring the gender norms. They were a stop in the progression of the LGBTQ movement, not even knowing it, not even wanting to be, and think that, the courage that it took to be who they were, although I felt that, after reading this book, they couldn't be anything else because of who they were.
Right.
And it was, it was very moving. Maybe talk a little bit more about what happens once they get caught by the Germans.
Right. So they spend basically 4 years writing these notes, as I said, right? Notes for the Nazis, leaving them around the island. The whole point of these notes is to demoralize the German soldiers. So basically they're writing these sort of, some of them are jokes, some of them are kind of funny dialogue, some of them are, sort of directed at Hitler, poems, various things. They're trying to find a way to kind of get inside the heads of the Nazis and to kind of convince them that the war effort is lost and that there's really no reason for them to be on Jersey. But of course, in doing this, they are also, violating German occupation rules. You're not supposed to be spreading propaganda. You're not supposed to be demoralizing the troops. That's a crime. And so once they are eventually caught, they're turned in by an informer and they're taken and arrested. The German soldiers, the secret field police officers come right around dinner time and knock on the door and begin a search of the house, then take them off to prison. And they're in prison for a while, and then eventually they're tried and convicted. But part of the story that I tell, and this is all from their writings, from their post-war writings, this is all from the sources that they left behind. The story of them in prison is also quite amazing because in a lot of ways they actually sort of continue their resistance work. They're put in separate cells, which is really the first time they're separated, since they're children. I mean, they've been together their whole lives. But they're able to communicate with one another in their cells through some secret note passing. But then they also pass notes to other prisoners, and they get to know some of the German soldiers who've actually been put in prison for mutiny or other crimes. And they get to know people in prison. They talk, they share ideas, they share notes and messages, and they actually comfort some of the other prisoners. And all of this, I think, is just in some ways a continuation of that resistance work that they had done with their note passing. It's just a way for them to push back against the Germans, but also really, I think it's driven by their sense of humanity. I think it's funny it may be funny for us to think about it, but a lot of their note writing, I think, was done because they felt sorry for the German prisoners or the German soldiers who were occupying the island. It seems strange to think that a prisoner would feel sorry for their jailer, but they saw these Germans as kind of Hitler's victims too, that Hitler had fooled them into prosecuting this war, and it was a pointless effort. And so they saw themselves, I think, as trying to help those soldiers. And then likewise, the other prisoners that they come into contact with, they're trying to help them as well. So they really act, I think, out of a real sense of humanity and a real sense of compassion for others.
Do bring out that kind of the gray area. And I think they did do out of a degree of empathy for the German soldiers. And it reminded me the whole time I was reading this book, it reminded me of a story my mother would tell me about when she was in France, her and her brother during the war in this town that was occupied by the Germans, that they would go to the pastry shop and look in the windows because they would dream about being able to eat the yummy pastries. And she says one day a German soldier walked in and he looked at them. And then when he walked out, he had bought them pastries. And that was the first time in my life I ever kind of thought about that gray area. And the other thing my mother said, and you bring this out so well in the book, is that there was a difference between the Nazis and your regular German soldier, if you will. But I think you bring, there's so much more to the book. I don't want you to give it all away in this interview. But one other thing I wanted to say that I thought about as I was reading it, if I was a German soldier, I feel like Jersey would have been the best place to be stationed during the war because, it wasn't as brutal as being on the war field. So that was the other thought I had as I was reading the book. It was a sweet deal to be there.
Right. It was a great assignment because it was not Russia, for one thing. It wasn't the Russian front. And there were a few soldiers that Lucy and Suzanne encountered who had been on the Russian front and then had been transferred to Jersey. What we know from the historical record that some of those battlefronts were particularly brutal. And by contrast, Jersey was a peaceful place. And actually a lot of the German soldiers, they talked about it almost as a land of milk and honey. It was a place where they could, almost have a kind of vacation in a sense. And yet at the same time, there was not fighting. But they also, I think, understood that this was still an important zone. They knew that it was part of this Atlantic Wall. They knew that it was a strategically important area. And they brought slave laborers from the East to Jersey and the other Channel Islands to build fortifications. And so even though the brutality was not there, they also, I think, understood, that this was important. Hitler was getting regular updates on the progress of construction of fortifications on the Channel Islands. So there was a direct, sort of oversight of what was going on the islands. And yet at the same time, there were young women on Jersey that many of the soldiers, fell for, or vice versa, and children that were born as a result of those relationships. There were, ways in which the German soldiers, they would attend church with the locals. They would be in the streets and in the shops with local Jersey folks. So that was another part of, in some ways, the dilemma that Lucy and Suzanne faced, because they saw so many people around them seemingly collaborating with the Germans or being nice to the Germans. That was part of the context of them having to decide, what should we do? Should we go along? Should we resist? And so, and yet at the same time, there were also other people resisting too. And so it's funny how, again, you think about these very sort of small local places. And once you really start to dig into it, the complexity of the story behind it, it's not a simple story where, the Germans all act one way and the locals all act another way. You find lots of different nuance and lots of different complexity really to the story. And that's, goes back to why I like these stories that are really focused on these, what seem to be small moments, but really kind of blossom out into these big and really sophisticated stories once you really dig into them.
So when did you come across this history, and why this history? Why did you decide to follow it down the rabbit hole?
I actually came to this story through their photographs, these photographs that they made in Paris in the 1920s and the 1930s. My wife is an art historian, and she, for many years, had taught a course on the history of photography. And so these two women, under their artistic names, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, have been known, especially among historians of photography, for some time. And so one day she showed me these photographs and she said, look at this. This is interesting. And she knew a little bit about the backstory of the wartime resistance, but she didn't know very much. She said, I think you'd be interested in this. And so I started looking at the photos, and I was very interested in the photos. And then I started trying to find out more about their biography. And there had been a lot of stuff written about their time in Paris, but much less written about their time during the war. And so as a historian of modern Europe, that was something that particularly interested me. And so that's where I really started digging to find out what I could find out about the war. But for me, it's all, their lives are all of a piece. The artistic work that they did in Paris, because it was so challenging and boundary pushing, it makes sense then that their work in Jersey as anti-Nazi resistors would also be boundary pushing and challenging. It's just their lives really, there's a consistency there. And I really began to see that as I started to look at the whole arc of their lives, the whole trajectory of their lives. And so, it's been a really great project to think about and to think about, the war in a different way. But again, having come to it, not through the war experience, but having come to it through their photographs, I sort of went on their journey with them in a way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do we see this story, this history in pop culture yet? Doesn't seem like it. Well, we do. I guess we do with their photographs.
Certainly we do with their photographs. There have been some things, some productions and talking about the history of the Channel Islands. There have been a couple of BBC series about the Channel Islands during the war, but nothing really about these two women in particular. And I think in a way, I think they've kind of slipped through the cracks because, people who think about the French resistance, and of course they were French by birth. They were born in southern France in the city of Nantes and moved to Paris in the 1920s. But people who study the French resistance don't study them because they weren't in France during the war. They were on Jersey. And the people who study the war on the Channel Islands don't really look at them as much because they were French. and so they were sort of outsiders in a way. And people who do study them from an art perspective or interested in their photography really only look at their time in Paris. And, the stuff during the war is kind of an afterthought or sort of a footnote to the story. So it's funny how they've kind of slipped through the cracks in a lot of ways. So as a result, I think we haven't seen their story being told, like in a movie or in, kind of pop culture ways. There is one novel that has been written, kind of a novelized version of their story during the war. But in terms of like other representations of that, there really haven't been. Of course, I'm hoping that maybe, some producer will read my book and and make a movie of it.
I am too. It's a great story.
Yeah, until that point, we'll have to wait.
Did you go to Jersey when you were researching this?
I did go to Jersey. I spent some time there. It's a wonderful place. I can understand why Lucy and Suzanne would want to retire there. For them, it was partly personal. They had spent time there over the years vacationing. It was a vacation spot for them. Lucy always had very ill health, and so I think they saw it as kind of a calm place, kind of away from the action. Little did they know how this would turn out. But and because they had money, because they were from wealthy families, they were able to buy a nice big house. And I've not been into the house, but I've been to the house, been able to see it from the outside, and it's right on the beach, so they could look out over the bay and go strolling on the beach, and it's a beautiful spot. The Channel Islands are not tropical islands; they are in the English Channel, so it's the temperature is not what we would think of. We think about the Caribbean or something, but they're palm trees and they're beautiful beaches, and it has that kind of island feel to it. And I was able to do research in the archive there. The folks there were really helpful and really great to work with. I think some of the folks on Jersey want this story to be told more. So like I said, they were very helpful in working with me. And I had a really wonderful visit, and I'm looking forward to going back very soon if I can, as soon as travel is possible.
What's the one thing that you want my listeners to take away from this history?
Well, that's a great question. There's so many things that I'd like people to think about, I guess. But I think maybe if I had to think of one thing, I would think about how many stories are out there like this that we don't know. We think we know the history of World War II, or we think we know the history of, whatever. But in fact, there are more stories to be told. There are a lot of voices that have been left out of our understanding of the past. And I think this is an example of a story that, now that hopefully it's out there, people are reading it and thinking about it, we can figure out how to integrate it into the bigger narrative of World War II, for instance. And, in a way, I've tried to do that with all of my work. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Paris Underwater. That was the story of the Paris flood of 1910. It was the second worst flood in the history of the city of Paris. And what's interesting about that flood, and it affected the entire city, and thousands of people were homeless as a result of this. What's interesting about that is that it's a story that very few people know. And it's strange because it had such a devastating effect on the city right at the turn of the 20th century, at this moment that Paris, was this supposed to be the most modern city in the world in many ways. And yet there was this colossal sort of technological and urban failure when the river bubbled up from the sewer system, came up into the streets. And yet all of the signs of that have been erased. The city was rebuilt. Of course, Paris still exists. It didn't drown. It didn't wash away. And so, when I was doing that book a number of years ago, I started talking to people about this story. People would say, "Oh, I've never heard of that story. I didn't know there was a big flood in Paris." Or if they knew about it, they only knew sort of a little bit. They'd heard about it kind of vaguely, but they didn't know many of the details. So So I wrote Paris Underwater, and it actually coincided with the 100th anniversary of the 1910 flood. So the book came out in 2010. People who've read it, always say this to me, like, how did you find this out? How did you know? I didn't know anything about this. So that's why I say I'm really attracted to those kinds of stories, because I think they help to reinvigorate our understanding of the past. They help us to understand that there are voices, that there are moments, that there are stories that are still yet to be told. And that's in some ways surprising, because we think, how could we find out something new? And yet there's always something new to find out.
There definitely is. Even in my own family, I'm working on a documentary about the children in Belgium during the war, World War II. And as I've gone on this journey, I went back to Belgium with my mother in 2012. There were so many things that I discovered that I didn't know, like my mother's great aunt, who she adored, her family was massacred in World War I by the Germans as they went through Belgium. And, it's a piece of family history I didn't know about. And yet that moment in history made me realize that going back there and looking at the children in Belgium in World War II, you can't look at that without looking at what happened in World War I. And I believe that history has so many gems to give us in the future. There's always a story. And that's one of the things I loved about your book, Paper Bullets, is that there are so many of those moments.
Well, I think that's true. And that's a great story there that you just told. And I think, it's for me, the great thrill as a historian, when I go to the archive and I'm able to go, and that's why I'm hoping to get back soon to do more digging and find, more stories like this. And there's that real sense of excitement. So it can be a personal story like what you were just saying, or it can be, a story that a historian finds in the library, in the archive. There's documents there somewhere. They're just waiting to be discovered or waiting to be read or to explore. And so it's a real sense of thrill when you find those stories, I think. And then it's such a great opportunity to be able to, come on a podcast like this and to share those stories with other folks who, might listen and say, wow, I didn't know that, and to feel energized too, to maybe go out and find their own stories, and to think about the past in a different way.
I had chills all week listening to the story. What do you want us to know about you? Where can we find you? What are you doing now?
Well, so I teach at Rhodes College in Memphis, and I teach a whole range of courses about European history and about environmental history and a number of other things. My website, jeffreyhjackson.com, has my whole bio and has lots of information about books that I've done.
What's on your horizon? Do you have any projects that you're working on?
I do have a project that I'm working on. I don't want to say a whole lot about it just because it's in such a very early stage and you never know where research is going to take you. But it's another one of these small stories that I think opens up into something much bigger. And in this case, it's a story about an episode that happens at the Berlin Wall. So a little bit later in time, a little different place. But the Berlin Wall has always fascinated me when I was a kid. And this is something that, I think has influenced me in terms of thinking about how I got to be where I am as a historian. My grandparents, when I was a kid and they had retired, they started traveling and they traveled the world. I mean, their first trip was a literally around the world trip. And they went to so many countries and they brought back stories and photographs and souvenirs. And I was always amazed by their stories and looking at their photos. And so they really helped to spark my imagination and my interest in all parts of the world and certainly in history. And so I remember their stories of talking about going through the Berlin Wall and going through Checkpoint Charlie and crossing into East Berlin, which they did more than once. I don't remember how many times they did it, but I remember them talking about the guards with the dogs and the mirrors that they would put under the bus to make sure no one was smuggling anybody or anything in or out. And so I've always been fascinated by the Berlin Wall. And so when I discovered this episode that I'm writing about, I made me think about them and think about all of those stories that they brought back over the years. And so we'll see where this research project takes me, but that's in the works right now.
Well, I look forward to seeing what you produce in the future. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
And there you have it, Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe, two undercover literary resistance operatives for the Allied forces. To find out more about Jeffrey H. Jackson, Paper Bullets, and some of his other works, be sure to check out our episode notes. Thanks for joining us and have a great week.